Welcome to Schoolin Around, a podcast hosted by Branching Minds featuring prominent leaders, subject matter experts, and thought innovators with their perspectives on the current challenges facing K-12 education. I'm your host, Larissa Napolitan, a former teacher, instructional coach, and a member of the Branching Minds team, here to lead conversations with educational leaders and experts that are on a mission to transform our schools and the lives of students. Today, I'm excited to welcome Dr. Judy Elliott and Dr. George Batsche, two experts in MTSS database decision-making and school improvement who we love here at Branching Minds. Dr. Judy Elliott is a fierce advocate for leveraging a data-driven approach to helping school systems equitably support the needs of all students. She has done this as the Chief Academic Officer of the LA Unified School District and now continues to support districts and national organizations and state departments of education with this work. And Dr. George Batsche is widely recognized for advancing the field of the School of Psychology through his research and leadership for establishing best practices in the response to intervention framework. He is responsible for formally and informally mentoring 50% of the thought leaders of MTSS, although that's a claim that is not driven by data, but was provided to us by our CAO, Dr. Eva Dundas. But both George and Judy have been extremely influential in shaping how Branching Minds approaches MTSS and have continually encouraged us to help educators take the next step towards better practice. And Dr. Eva Dundas claims that there's data to back that up, but we don't know if we can trust her after that last stat. So, but we welcome you both here today to have a conversation. And thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Larissa. I really appreciate it.
Well, before we dive into our questions, we want to hear what's on your mind related to MTSS. What are you hearing from districts that you work with, and what trends are you seeing?
Judy?
Dr. Batsche. So I'm happy to start. I think the trends that I'm seeing is people are feeling overwhelmed because it's an inch deep, mile wide. We're doing too many things, lots of things going on. I think the other thing that I'm excited about is that folks are beginning to get more comfortable in using data-driven decision-making, problem solving around data. And I think that, in that the leadership is always a big deal when you're leading it at a district or a school level. So I would summarize that by saying, make the main thing. If you're doing MTSS, it's the main thing, and have everything integrate into that. So that's sort of things I'm hearing in the field.
So kind of building on that a little bit, the thing that has impressed me the most is how implementing MTSS has evolved. We've been doing it for 20 years, never comfortable with where we are, always looking for ways to improve. And so for me, the last 12 to 18 months, the big message has been each of the components of MTSS, and there are 6, here you go. The 6 components of MTSS that comprise the framework of MTSS are not theoretical. They're there because each one of those components contributes significantly statistically to student outcomes if they're done the way that research says they should be done. So, one quick example is we know that leadership accounts for about 29% of the variance that predicts student outcomes, but only if you have a certain kind of leadership, collective leadership. So the thing that's important as we implement MTSS, and somebody on this podcast coined the phrase a few years ago, you use MTSS to do MTSS. So I think that if we're implementing the MTSS framework to improve student outcomes, rate of growth, then we have to be familiar with how each of these components can be implemented to achieve that growth. So we are providing you with some references. Do you have the table that is just one other slide we had? to put up here. That table, for instance, is just taking the 6 components and saying how much that component contributes to student outcomes and the research that supports it. So we'll talk more about that as we go through. But the takeaway, I think, for today is if you're implementing MTSS to improve student outcomes, you have to use each of the 6 components in a way that will ensure those outcomes happen. And in the past 5 years or so, we now have research that can tell you how to use each of those components. So that's my big takeaway for today.
I think that you're right in the fact that like all of those contribute in different manners and some have more weights than others. I know, that it's important to look to research into how much time and effort you have to spend on each of those components and having that framework. And so last year, I know we asked you this question, but I think it's still highly relevant. And so we want to ask you this again, maybe just to kind of see how if your answer differs. But so we know that there's a staggering amount of students that need support in many different areas and they're still regaining footing from the past few years. So with all of those challenges facing students, educators, and districts today, where do leaders start when addressing these areas, particularly if they're overwhelmed with the number of students that need support or the level of the support that's needed? So where do they start?
Go ahead, Dr. Batsche. They asked you this last year, so have at it.
Okay, I'll probably say the same thing as I said last year. So people, I often work with groups that think that the MTSS triangle is turned upside down when there are 50, 60% of the students in a district or a school that are struggling. It never gets turned upside down. The issue is when you have that many students who are struggling, you have to relook at your core, how you're delivering core instruction. The other thing is that in those situations, we're probably going to focus only on tier 1 and tier 2 and ensuring that we use all of those resources to support students. An example of how to do that would be that whoever's providing tier 2 supports, whether that's in the classroom teacher or other people, the whole lesson planning process, those tiers have to be coordinated. The scope, sequence, and pacing of instruction has to be the same. Materials have to be the same. We can't separate out and silo those tiers. So if it's done right, for example, you can use pre-teaching through a support group, support process, to have the core delivery of that lesson actually be a do-over. Judy Elliott's term, second scoop. So I think that we have to just relook at what the challenge is that we have to do. One other thing, we know that there are instructional practices to use in tier 1 that are also validated for different subgroups of students. Know what those instructional practices are and use them. And the other thing is, once you start providing increased supports for this group of students, they're not going to be homogeneous. Some of those students are going to grow faster than the others. So you're going to have more frequent progress monitoring. You cannot treat them as a homogeneous group once you start doing this instruction. So that's what I would say to that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I'm curious to hear what Judy would say, just since you weren't here last year, if you had any thoughts as well.
Yeah, well, I disagree with everything he just said. No, I'm kidding. I think student voice, I'm going to take a little different, I think leaders, I've had an opportunity to lead a national sort of event session with student leaders from across the country. And we got them together and we said, what is it that, leaders, teachers need to do to regain the footing to get you back into it. And, the overarching was mental health was the overarching issue. And there were 3 strands underneath it. One was safety. We had a gal who talked about the 2 times she experienced lockdown in her high school. So mental health, but safety, inclusion, and diversity. And then the last one was how schools and districts are spending their money. So my takeaway from that conversation was said we'd like the adults to do it with us instead of to us. And so while we're having all of these, what do we do to regain, kids' engagement in school and getting them, it was really powerful to hear it from the youth about what they need. Because mental health, Center for Disease Control and Prevention, they published a study in 2021 that talked about 40% of the high school students that they surveyed had sadness and hopelessness. 22% had considered suicide. 10% had tried it. So the mental health obviously is big. And the only way that we know when we did this effort was really to bring students to the table and say, hey, what do you need? Let them know they're cared for. So to me, that's sort of, yes, everything that George said, absolutely. And to get them to the door and get them to the table, we got to listen to them.
Yeah. And I think student voice is one of those things where we kind of, it feels secondary, but it really should be a primary, especially at the secondary level. And I know maybe we'll talk a little bit more about the MTSS at the secondary level, but that student voice piece. And I wanted to highlight what you said about like not doing things to us, but with us.
Yeah.
And I think, there's a lot of teachers that also are dealing with the mental health for themselves too. And I speak as someone who taught during COVID and had to like navigate all of that. And so it's like doing some of those practices with students is actually a really transformative and a way to build an experience with them. And to have that is really important for the kids to understand that like some of those mental health practices aren't just things you do as a teen or as a student, but you also, that's a life thing that you do all the time. So I feel like some of those things we can kind of build in that. And so I appreciate that you highlighted the student voice piece. And I know there's probably secondary people listening that want to practice more about like getting the input from their students.
Yeah,
so
powerful.
Yeah, along with this, like MTSS is meant to help educators really like implement support for students at all levels, but it's a system level piece. Like you can't just do it in your classroom, by like it's the whole system is impacted. So when we talk about kind of empowering teachers, that's part of our theme this year. What system level structures could we put in place to help empower teachers and support staff and support, like we were talking about, supporting their mental health and well-being as well, and encouraging longevity in the field, because we see a lot of teachers leaving because of the impact of mental health and things like that. So maybe let's talk. I would love to hear what you have to say sort of about how do we support and empower those teachers with the system level change.
So a theme that runs all the way through MTSS as a framework is having a culture of collaboration and support. We're providing you with resources that you can access later that basically talks about collective leadership. Judy a moment ago said, this is not something that needs to be done to us from the student voice perspective. Teachers feel the same way. Collective leadership will create an environment in which decisions are made collectively, not only between administration and teachers, but also that student voice comes in here in particular. So something else we've learned in the past 3 to 5 years is that anything done as a team, collaboration as a team, problem solving as a team, that results in greater outcomes and greater level of supports than when individuals do it. And interestingly, the research is clear that when individuals do this stuff, you don't see the improvement in student outcomes. I'm also going to go back to the research of Joyce and Showers, which kind of informed the whole professional learning process over time. They had 2 big ideas: that teachers will embrace and support and feel good about change if 2 conditions happen. One is they clearly understand the need for it, and the other is they either have the skills or feel comfortable that they will get the skills. Fear of failure can be a huge mental health issue. That is a voice in the back of your head. So empowering teachers is about the collective environment. It's about a professional learning process that doesn't ask the teachers to do and others more than they know how to do, and to have these supports like any good mental health comprehensive system.
Yeah. Oh, I what you said about that collective efficacy, right? Like that collective work. I've talked about that before in the podcast of just about the power that has for, outcomes. And then also I think that idea of teachers feeling that they are, that they're not asked to do more than they can kind of handle or have the capacity to, or they know that they're going to get the security, that they know that they're going to have the support along the way. Because the worst thing for a teacher or for many educators is like, here, implement this thing. We're not going to give you any training. We're not going to help you along the way, but we want you to still do it. And so I think that that's really true, is this leaders really thinking through of if we're going to ask them to do this, we have to help them all be on the same page, and then also provide the support along the way. The same that you would ask for students, right? I think there's, you'd ask that of the adults. Dr. Elliott, do you have any additional?
Absolutely. I would add, my wrinkle to that is that we know, at least in my world, behavior is top of mind for lots of teachers and leaders.
Yes.
So, especially post-COVID, for all the reasons that we know. So I just wanted to share that Education Week did a survey where they asked the kids, and this is really relevant because it's secondary-ish, if you will. So they asked all the kids, if you could make your school better and feel more motivated in your school, they gave them a whole list of things to pick from. The top choice, I'll give you the top 3 for teachers and kids. Give me a chance to redo a low grade. So, that is just right at the tip of our nose. They just said, if we could have an opportunity to redo a low grade, I would be much more engaged and motivated. The second one was, let me do assignments on topics that are interested me, flavor of universal design for learning, right? That are interested me, that can show the evidence of what you're teaching I'm learning. And then the third one was, incorporate humor and fun into teaching. Make it fun for us. So they asked the same question of the teachers, and the teachers' top pick was offer more hands-on experiences for kids, field trips, all of those yummy things that you can do in internships, all of those things. The second one they talked about was, show students that they can, how they can use what they learn for their future careers, right? Why are we learning this? And then the third one for the teachers was really offer a choice to students so they can demonstrate their learning in a different way. Also universal design-ish. Right. So I thought that was really interesting because behavior is such a big deal. And again, it's student voice and what do teachers and kids need in order to be fulfilled and have long-term sustainability to do the hard work that it is.
I think it could be really beneficial to kind of think about how can we make things relevant and interesting to their world. I think just a lot of times that we don't do that. So you kind of mentioned, one of you touched on this, but I think a topic that's on top of a lot of people's mind is getting teachers to buy in to the process of MTSS. Part of it, the big system. So maybe if you want to just kind of talk a little bit about what do we think of the biggest barriers to effectiveness to buy-in? I know that maybe some of them are similar to what you already mentioned, but how do we help teachers bring them on board?
Well, and I'll start with that. Folks have initiative fatigue. We have gone down so many rabbit holes that didn't lead anywhere. So then when you come in and say, oh, now we're going to do MTSS, in some places, MTSS is a dirty 4-letter word. So don't use it. Use data-driven decision-making. So for me, the 2 questions I always start with this work is I ask folks, are you happy with your data? And are you, is every classroom in your school, your building, your district, one that you place your own flesh and blood? And usually I don't get affirmative answers to either one of those questions. So that's where we start. And so I always say you have to build on ramps for folks. You've got to have the relationships with folks to have this. You've got to build the trust. You have to have the compelling why. Why are we going to do this? Well, when you start with your data and look at who's doing well and who's not, and I would summarize it. And George, you said it earlier, use MTSS to do MTSS. You can't just do it to folks. You got to do it with them. And then my final thought would be, it's about instructional coherence or instructional program coherence, about having teachers see the connection so that everybody's pulling, rowing in the same direction in the same boat, where every element of instruction, enhancement, intensification of instruction, all of that stuff is leading toward the same end goal, which is getting kids to the same grade level standard. So they don't see it as one-offs, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. The same thing of like when you're connecting, you got to connect those things for students, right? Connect the dots, and the same thing for teachers as well. George, did you have something to add there? Sorry if I interrupted you.
Oh, no. So we've had a couple of these themes, right? So if there's collective leadership in a building, then teachers and other staff are actively involved in making the decisions about what's going to happen. That's going to build ownership on their part. If they're building it, then they're going to be committed to doing it. The second thing is, we're already doing in every building in the United States something in each of the components of MTSS. We're doing something with data. We're doing something with leadership. So we want to build on whatever the unit is that's wanting to implement MTSS. We've got to build on what they're already doing. And that has to be an explicit statement. We're not going to throw out what we've been doing. We're going to strengthen and improve what we have been doing. And the final thing is, we've already mentioned this, when collaboration is building wide, it's highly effective at engaging students and teachers and other staff in the work. So I think those three things, and as Judy said, being sure that you're explicit about why we're doing this.
Yeah.
Because the message, if it isn't a building thing, the message is we're doing it because what you've done has failed. That's not the message we want to have here.
Right.
Not going to send the new principals to fix up a school that has failed or a district that has failed. So this collective leadership, collaboration, and the supports we talked about will result in buy-in.
Well, it keeps you from going down rabbit holes that you don't need to go down.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, and I was just thinking of like the idea of building on what you already have. I think there is that impression of like, oh, we're doing this new thing at MTSS, right? Like we're initiative fatigue, right? Like you said, there's just so many new things. And so I even think sometimes the starting point is like really examining what resources, what things are we already doing? How are we already supporting students, and building on that, examining and evaluating of like, what other resources do we need, and looking either to the community to fulfill that, or like whether you can work your finances to allow for other resources. I just think that the starting point really is going, what are we already doing right? And then what are the ways that we can like fill in the areas for what's, the ways we can improve.
Well, and I would add to that is, we always start with resource mapping or asset mapping. And it's inevitable that you work with schools or school districts and they're like, I didn't know we had that program. Where's it been? So we have lots of stuff that we don't all know. The common language, common understanding about resources, expectations, all of that stuff is like, what do you have? What are you using for tier 1, 2, and 3 for, the thing? So to your point, really starting with what you have that you may not know you have.
Well, and I even think too, like when you think at a larger district, right, there are, there's some miscommunication between schools, right? And maybe there's resources that one school has that's really effective and other schools don't know that. And so really trying to like bring together those communications and really evaluate what interventions do we have available for tier 2? If this is really working at the school, maybe we can use it other places. And I think like that's part of that collective leadership that has to happen district wide and in the building as well.
So the best, to just tag on that, the best professional development learning you can do, in my opinion, is for teachers by teachers. So if you're doing something and it's going well, y'all come and watch me do it, or I'll come and model it for you. So for teachers by teachers, instead of, it's right at our nose. And so all of that stuff is just so important.
Yeah. Some of the best, I appreciated some of the best professional development I've ever attended was actually during the pandemic, and we had like a choice board where everybody volunteered to sort of lead like a lesson from their classroom, or even just like
Mm.
it allowed the like leaders even to go in and participate, and did these live sessions over just
Nice.
practices they did in their classroom, and it was fantastic. It was a great way to share what works well with the students you have, and it can be district wide as well. So
Yeah.
I appreciate that. So okay, we kind of started on this, but like, do you guys have some advice for those that are starting or even struggling to start their MTSS? We talked about like resource allocation. Maybe there's people that are just trying to get this jump started at their local level, or maybe they're just a few years in and they're trying to feel comfortable. Do you have any advice to help them get past that initial starting point?
So I would say there's a number of things, and we don't have that much time. I know George is going to talk about the 6 critical components. That is definitely where we start with that, to say, of those 6, which ones do we need to focus on? And I think it's, why are we wanting to do these things, and how do we connect? We just had this conversation. How do you connect it to the things you're already doing well? And I always say there's some stuff on the stove that we need to stir a little faster, some that needs to go on the back burner, and some needs to come all the way off the stove because that's not what we need to do. There also needs to be has to be a district leadership team. It's not just about pushing it down to the school leadership teams. You have to have your district leadership team that they too can finish each other's sentences about a common language, common understanding about what you're doing. And that could be people like from HR and from business and from finance. All of these people need to be around the table, because you have to look at your infrastructures that you have and that you need, and build that consensus. My friend Steve Kukik said to me once, if you're leading a parade, make sure people are behind you. Otherwise, you're just taking a walk. So if you're doing this and you don't have consensus and people aren't with you, it's going to be all in vain. And so non-negotiables, what are your non-negotiables at the school level and at the district level? What are your non-negotiables? Do you have a board policy for it? I mean, George and I, when we work with places, first thing we do is they create a board policy around data-driven decision-making, MTSS. So I would just say that the thing that you really need to emphasize of all of the things that we've talked about is, it's not another thing, but it is the thing. So it's not an add-on. It's what we're doing. This is our work.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's like enveloping everything under the banner of this thing.
Yeah.
That's why I always say it's like, not another thing. It's just the umbrella over everything. Yeah. George, did you have any other insights in that?
Yeah, I'm going to be a little edgy on this one.
Ooh, we love hot takes here at Schoolin Around.
Everything that Judy said. You cannot implement sustainable MTSS if you're doing it only at the school level. It simply is not going to work.
But that's what we do. That's what a lot of places do.
Yeah, we're called and saying we have 5 schools we want to implement MTSS. Call somebody else, because schools can't have their own data systems. Schools can't have their own scope, sequence, and pacing of curriculum. That's curriculum and instruction stuff. So if a district really wants to do this and sustain it, exactly what Judy said, it begins with the superintendent and the school board. Getting a policy, ensuring that the curriculum stuff is at the district level. And I'm going to say a little side thing here, edgy. The Office of Curriculum and Instruction almost never deals with instruction. They deal with curriculum. So for the kinds of the needs of the students in our district, that should be the Curriculum and Instructions Office to provide schools with what instructional strategies are best for our population of students to deliver our curriculum, right? So data, curriculum. The last thing I'll get edgy on is Judy said, this is not another thing. It's the thing. So if that's true, then everybody at the district level who is supporting this initiative has to have FTE time allocated to this effort. If it's another thing that these district people are doing, then it comes across as it's not the thing. It's another thing.
Yeah.
So if I'm the superintendent and we build the team that Judy talked about, the first thing I'm going to do is to say, how much of your time to do these tasks do you need in a week? And we're going to assign FTE to the effort.
And it's not more FTE, you repurpose what you're already doing. You take your instructional coaches and they become a broader instructional coach. It's not necessarily because, we can't always, Fort Knox is closed. We aren't going to get any more money. So repurpose, reallocate what you're doing. Know what you're doing is having, an impact, and the stuff that's not, you just repurpose. And one pushback, George, I would have on what you said is that you called it an initiative, and it's not an initiative.
No, it is the framework for how we're going to school our kids.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm done pushing.
No, you're fine. I was just going to say there was something you said about, like if something's not working, stop doing that. And one of the best things I've read in this last year, there's something about do more subtracting than adding, of really thinking through what are the things that we're doing that are not effective? What is the resources we're using that are not effective? And just take them off the board, like kind of come back to the minimal, like start with a more minimalist view and then add from there. And rather than starting with all the different things you have going on and we're going to add this and add that. Because the thing that teachers don't love to hear is we're going to do more. Here's more, right? Yeah. Doing more is really the thing that is burning a lot of teachers out. It's we're doing this and this and this, and now we're going to add this other thing, but really trying to sort of restructure the system in a way that's here's all the, to make it sustainable, right? Because we can't sustain it if we don't have capacity to do that. And so many teachers I know, and so many educators we talk to, even administrators, they're at capacity. They have not a lot left. Yeah, they've been at capacity. And so really, how can we help them subtract from what they're doing, or not even, subtract, but also structure it in a way that's really more feasible.
Well, and what pops into my head, Laura, says, use your data to say what's working and what's not. Are you getting a return on investment in everything you're doing? Probably not. Then why do we keep doing it? So, the fun activity I always like to do with staff that say they're overwhelmed and they can't do anymore is say, okay, tell me what I can take off your plate. Tell me, what is it that and inevitably people said, well, we can, it's all important. Okay, well, now we have a problem. So how do we, to your point, how do we integrate that? How do we make sure that it all fits like a puzzle? I always say, build your tapestry. How does it all fit? And tell the story.
Yeah.
So
but it is about streamlining those systems. And really, when you have a proper system, I know for me, it's if I have all the things in my head that I need to do, but I don't have a system to way to prioritize, what needs to get done first, it's overwhelming. And so part of the work of a school leader is to really, do that prioritization of all the different things. So, okay, we've got a little time left.
Add one more.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead. Go
ahead.
ahead.
Dr. Batsche, there's no time left.
There is. I'm looking at the time. There's plenty of time. So Kristen, a person named Kristen, posted a comment and said that we spent so much money on this curriculum that even if it's not working, we're going to keep it because we spent so much money on it.
Yeah.
That's not an instructional decision, right? So I'm going to use an analogy here. Curriculum is like the motor of a car. Instruction is the transmission of converting that curriculum into instructional action for students. The same analogy goes with the district. The district level, what they do is like the motor of a car. The schools are like the transmission. Schools have to translate what that district has given them into implementation. So if a district is putting everything on teachers, they got to figure out the data by themselves. They have to figure out which are the best instructional strategies to go with this curriculum. They have to figure out how to do problem solving. Then the teachers are overwhelmed, rightfully so, because I believe in many cases the district is not providing the supports that are really needed. They're doing traditionally what districts do. And my biggest peeve is around instruction. In your curriculum and instructional office, you pick a curriculum. Hopefully, as Judy said, students want a voice in that, because if they're interested in that kind of stuff, then they'll engage it. But if they pick the curriculum, they also have the responsibility for providing teachers and schools with the instructional strategies that will convert that curriculum into student growth.
And technical assistance.
Teachers don't have the time to do that. Principals don't. That is a district responsibility.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the last thing I'm going to say about this, as long as you give me the mic,
Take it away.
is teachers can't use data and numbers. Teachers need to know, do the data tell me that it's working for this kid and the kid is growing at a faster rate than expectations to close a gap? Is it not working, or is it borderline working? You know, you look at your
Yeah.
positive, questionable, and poor responses to instruction. That's all teachers and teacher teams should have. They should.
Okay, I'm taking the mic away.
Huh?
I'm taking the mic away.
So all I'm saying is that
Yeah.
we need to start with what the district should be doing in an MTSS, so that teachers can then take it and implement it without feeling like they have to do everything.
Well, and my one point to this, now that I have the mic, is if you are continue to use a curriculum that you know is not getting return on investment and is not improving your student outcomes, you're going to have a lot more kids falling into tier 2 and tier 3 because tier 1 is not meeting the needs of kids. So you're just making your life exponentially more difficult if you're using an ineffective curricula for the students that you have in front of you. So,
And it's going to cost you a lot more money in the long run.
Absolutely. And
Yeah.
heartburn and
And some teacher turnover too. But I think that what you said is really correct in the fact that, like, at the district level, really doing that work. Because I think one of the struggles is I had as a teacher, and then I stepped into the role of instructional coach, and I had so much more time to get into the research and find the instructional strategies.
Same.
I didn't have that time as a teacher. It was a lot of trial and error. And so, like, to be able, when I had that time as an instructional coach, to be able to do the work to help teachers and provide them with instructional strategies and resources and things that I could, we worked hard we had to do a lot of work at the district level. We were building a playbook of instructional strategies to provide to our teachers because we knew that they were limited time. And so I think that there can be intentional work done at that district level that can make a big impact for teachers, and to, like, sort of release some of that burden that they have to do the work to, like, dig in and find all of those different things that work for students. Okay. I have a couple more questions. So I really want to get to this question. So if we'll come back to the other one, but secondary schools, shout out to all the secondary schools in the audience. You can give us a comment. It's really hard to implement MTSS at the secondary level. Hard in the fact that there's a lot of different factors than at the elementary. So can it be done? Is it possible? Do you have some examples to share or
Absolutely.
some insight into that? Yeah.
I'm personally doing a lot of work with secondary schools, and absolutely. And some of the things that, you have to look at is your schedule. Do you have time in your schedule to provide, more time? So I always like to ask our secondary folks, do you have kids in your building that can't read? And I usually get, oh yeah. And then my second question is, who's teaching them? Yeah. Well, our schedule. If that was your kid not being able to read, what would you expect the school to do? So it's creating a schedule, and it's hard, but you sit down and you do what needed to do. You have to find it. If you have study halls, you capture those and repurpose them. If you've got, you can skim passing minutes, and there's ways to get minutes to do this. Going back to what George talked about your PLC time or your collaboration time, make sure that all your colleagues are having an opportunity to talk to each other. I talked about resource and asset mapping, really important at the secondary level, because it gets tricky. I mean,
it's a lot more siloed.
Yeah. If you do a second scoop for ELA, or you do a second scoop for a second section for math, you have to make sure, the kids are getting credit for that as an elective, and that there is a curriculum that's being taught. It's not just a glorified study hall. Access to data, huge data systems. And so what we do, and George is also a part of all of this as well, is we create early warning systems for high schools, for secondary schools, where you triangulate your attendance to your grade level, to your credits, to your office referrals. And then, then you have conversations about, well, if you have a kid that is coming to school every day and failing everything, that's different than a kid who doesn't come to school and is passing everything. So they're voting with their feet. So a lot of stuff at the secondary level is really based on infrastructure and decision making to make this work at the secondary level. So early warning systems are the ticket, and they really help you, give you the data that you need to revamp your schedules.
Yeah.
Dr. Batsche.
So yeah, absolutely. I mean, Judy does more work with secondary, but I totally agree with her that where we do work with secondary, in some ways, I think it's easier because the mindset of secondary teachers is very much around use of data, whether that's electronic grade books. They embrace the science of it. But I also think that we have to stop looking at it as a secondary level beginning in high school. We have to consider how what we're doing in middle school and how that is linked to what the high schools need students to know, understand, and do. The other question so we know from early warning systems that that even in 6th grade, we can predict with a good level of accuracy on-time graduation rates or not.
Yeah.
So how are we using our middle schools collaboratively with high schools, particularly 9th grade, counselors, staff, and others, to ensure that the product we're sending to 9th grade has greater capacity to survive in that environment? I'm going to give one quick example, particularly in places where so many students are struggling. Why do we wait till 9th grade for the students to understand credits? And we've worked with numerous districts that start putting in a pseudo credit on the report cards in middle school so that students understand the relationship between A, B, C, D, and F and credit earning. So I think that this process begins early on. Judy already talked about the schedule. We have instant access to data with electronic grade books at middle and high school that, when organized around critical questions, are just as good as progress monitoring data in making decisions. I'm not saying they are progress monitoring, but that electronic grade book is a source of database problem solving, in addition to putting it in there to get grades. It does require that people update that electronic grade book on a regular basis and don't wait till a week before the 9-week grades are due.
Yeah.
So the answer is, can you do it in the secondary? Absolutely. Absolutely. And we need to.
Yeah.
Because we're the only thing between us and the kids going into society and being successful. So if they can't read, it's on us.
Well, and
using technology in the secondary level. If you've got a 9th grade student reading at the 4th grade level, you're not going to teach that student to read fast enough to be successful.
That's compensatory skills at that point. Yeah.
You use UDL and those principles to scaffold students for success.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I can speak as a middle school teacher. It is, when you get a student that is struggling with reading, as a middle school teacher trained in secondary
elementary schools.
Yeah. Well, and I was trained to teach literature. And so that training that goes into understanding reading, I think it's a big factor for, I think, middle school and high school teachers having that basis of understanding of how to teach reading in different ways could be really helpful as well. And then I also wanted to talk about the gradebook thing, because I do think that there is sort of there's a trend now, standards-based grading and things like that. I kind of dip my toe into that as a teacher, really trying to break down the skills and try to, use that as part of their grades to really have their grade reflect their ability. Because oftentimes a grade for a student may reflect compliance or the fact that they can turn things in. And so I do think that is, something to reflect upon. Our grading practice is really reflective of monitoring the students' progress and their understanding of the content and their ability level, rather than just that compliance. But that's a hard thing, because I do think that that's so ingrained at the secondary level. There's just some practices that maybe need to be re-examined. I think it's important to re-examine, and as our speaker this morning talked about, is just have an awareness and acknowledge ways that we can change things. So okay.
Judy mentioned earlier about students wanting to be able to redo a grade, right?
Yeah.
So in most of the high school curricula, there are units. Take algebra, take trig. There are units. teachers can use that grade book to take a look at performance of students, and you're going to find units that even your strongest students, that's the one they struggled with the most. And that can affect their pacing charts, providing more time for that. We work with places where the students, to fix their grade, go back to the units they failed, not the course they failed, and then redo those units, be evaluated on those units, not the entire algebra scope, sequence, and pacing.
So if I can add an example to George to highlight that. So work with a secondary school that went after D's and F's, right? They said, we got too many kids with D's and F's. Let's figure out how we're going to get the kids from D's and F's. So they gave out a student survey or a teacher survey. And what turned out, their goal changed because they found out that some teachers let the kids make up their assignments. Some teachers let them make up an assessment some teachers like, nope, you get a 0. Nope, you can't do that. And so what they found out is the D's and F's were directly related to your point, George, the rules and routines and procedures that were not calibrated across teachers. And so now places are saying, okay, the math department's going to use this sort of rhythm to their calibration. The English, it doesn't have to be equal across the whole school, but that is contributing to more D's and F's because we're not calibrated. And so now the kids have to shift gears every time they go to a different class. So anyway, I just wanted to add that.
And something as simple as not confusing productivity with accuracy. So some teachers, if a student only does a certain amount of the test or assignment, whatever they didn't do goes into that final grade.
Right.
As opposed to evaluating the work
many
that they
ways.
did do. Exactly.
Yeah.
All those things can be examined to make high school students feel like they have a chance.
I do.
And that's,
yeah.
I was going to say that's such a disheartening, especially when kids come into 9th grade and they maybe fail one semester of a course. And oftentimes in high school, that means they're still qualified as a freshman and they've got to, before they can move on. And that's why those early warning indicators can be such so valuable. And I think you're right. Kids understanding credits at the middle school level, I think is really key into some of them have no idea when they get to 9th grade. Oh, I fail a class and I don't just move on, because that is a norm. So I think reflecting on those practices is really, really important. Okay, we've got about 10 minutes left. Maybe 9 if Maureen wants to get on here and give us some housekeeping stuff. But I want to address a couple of questions. I love hearing from the secondary people. But someone asked about addressing how to address initiative fatigue. How do we go about addressing that initiative fatigue? Is it just something we can, once we've mapped our resources, what would you recommend for leaders dealing with that?
Well, for me, initiative, we have earned the initiative fatigue because we kept doing it to folks. So I think it's an open conversation. I mean, I think in some of the stuff you're going to do, you may not have 100% consensus to do some things because you're always going to have folks that are not quite there. But I think that if you lead with your data and you give voice and choice to, we've been doing this for a long time, our data doesn't show any improvement. So now we need to have a conversation about what are we going to do instead or in addition or whatever. So for me, initiative fatigue it's a trust thing. And that's why, when we talk about this, George and I, first thing we always do is make sure the board has a policy and the board is behind this because it matters more to folks. In many places that the board has created a policy that this is the work that we're getting behind and we're going to do. So initiative fatigue, it's a trust issue. And so starting with your data, and I always say baby steps for baby feet. You got to pick and choose what you're going to do to earn that trust and people to really believe in what you're doing.
So I think the why of doing it, getting away from initiative, that this is going to become the framework. But before you even get to the decision that you're going to do it, I think all levels of the educational enterprise in a district need to come together to make that choice collectively. So the group that's looking at this, there needs to be teacher representation. There needs to be principal representation. So everybody who's going to be affected by this needs to be in the conversation that leads to the decision to do it. And once again, this is what Judy said before. This is the thing. It's not another thing.
Well, and yeah, you have to listen to history. You've got historians on your faculties that have been here. Well, we did that 10 years ago. We did that 20 years ago. Okay, you got to have all that conversation get out on the table.
And
Yeah.
what MTSS brings that is a good mitigator of initiative fatigue is they may have, just what Judy said, just caused this thought in my head. They may have been doing all of those things individually, but they've never done them in an integrated, coherent way. So for example, we know that classroom instruction accounts for about 33% of what predicts student outcomes. Leadership, done the right way, can count for up to 29%. And take a look at, for those of you watching this, take a look at the Wallace report from February of 2021. 29 and 33, although you can't arithmetically necessarily do it, you have control in a school setting over the vast majority of what predicts student outcomes. So put your energy into what you can control. You can't control frequent flyers. You can't control the fact that a student has been in 7 schools in 9 years. So the framework is different from initiatives because it talks about how these 6 components complement each other to value add. And therefore, it eases the amount of burden across the whole system. That's the difference between an initiative and a framework.
That's good. I think that that's really true of just thinking about like, what are the important components that you have control over. And I think that works at the leadership level. I think that works at the teacher level. There are many times as an educator in the classroom where like I only could do so much, and I could do what I could do within the walls of my classroom, or as a leader in the school, there are only things that I can do within the building, and really focusing on those things and doing those things well. One of the last questions I had was really about any advice on what maybe they should focus on based on what you're seeing with trends around MTSS.
Go, Judy.
Oh, I was going to let you go first.
No, you go.
So for me, it would be going back to the 6 components. Of those 6 components, what are your low-hanging fruit? What are those things that, you're ready to take on? It's not forced choice. It's what you're ready to take on. But those 6 components, what are those things that may need more ramping up, and your ears are up for that. So once you sort of get a handle on the 6 components, I would be wanting to listen for information that will help shore up or get us ready to address some of the areas. And you're amongst implementers, so network for sure. So listen to everything.
I think also going back to what are you currently doing that you can build on?
Yeah.
But let's also just talk about a couple of things very quickly that can be the kiss of death, if you will. The idea that the tiers are separate and that people who do tier 2 are not tier 1 people, and people who do support tier 3 are not tier 2 people. So common language, common understanding is really important. Tier 1 is what everybody does to support all students. Tier 2 is what everybody does to support some students. Tier 3 is what everybody does to support a few students. So I think these mindsets are really important when you begin to build the foundation for this framework in your setting.
And I think, I'm sorry, I would add to that. I think that most people are familiar with what you just talked about. They think about it's the tiers, not these tiers, but the tiers. It's way bigger than the tiers. If you look at those 6 critical components, way bigger. And so I would say, open that a little bit more and look at all the other things, leadership, capacity building. And then the other thing I would add is that MTSS is not just about your kids that are at risk. The question needs to be asked is, what are we doing for our highly able kids? How are we taking our high kids and giving them more opportunity to grow and accelerate? So it's not just the low to medium kids, it's our highly able students that we've left behind for lots of time. So That's
And
what I
it-
wanted to
yeah.
add to that.
It is a system of supports.
Yes.
It's not a way
For
to
all kids.
differentiate kids.
Yeah. For all
It's a
kids.
system of supports. This issue, how does MTSS address equity? Very simple. You cannot give equal supports to all students and get equitable outcomes. That's what the tiers are about. We need to differentiate supports for equitable outcomes. And if you're in a mindset where, well, it's not fair that these students are getting more of this, then you will have equality of services, but inequity of outcomes.
And I'm going to take that one hair in a different way. Equity is at the end of our nose. So if you have one teacher that's a rock star and one teacher that's not so much of a rock star, there's an equity. It depends on which kid gets which teacher to say that you now have an equity amongst kids. So leveling the playing field means all teachers have to be at their best in order to create equity. It's even right in our backyard equity that we have control over, is making kids have equitable access to excellent teaching and learning.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, I just think about that. You give students what they need, but the
When they
problem
need
is that like if some teachers aren't able to do that in the same manner or the same level. And I also want to address, you're talking about students, the high achievers. I think of MTSS a little bit as the diamond a little bit too, right? Where
Diamond,
you have
yes.
both spectrums.
Diamond, yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, I know that we have this conversation a lot in our team of just talking about how the high achievers they deserve the same amount of growth, a year's worth of growth like other students do. And so, what are we doing for them as well? What's built into
What's their
tier
tiers?
1? Yeah. What are their tier 1? I'm just going to plug, we got a guide coming out about that next week. So we're excited to just have more of those conversations. Okay. This was a fantastic conversation. I loved getting to chat with both of you. Thank you for bringing the hot takes and sharing your knowledge with us. Thanks for listening to Schoolin Around, a podcast hosted by Branching Minds. And don't forget to subscribe to this podcast to hear all our future episodes. As well, if you're enjoying our content, would you do us a favor and rate and review our podcast on iTunes? This helps others find our podcast and let us know how much you love what we're creating. Branching Minds is an educational technology company using learning sciences and technology to help districts effectively personalize learning through MTSS. To learn more about us, check out our website, branchingminds.com, or follow us on Twitter, Facebook, or LinkedIn @BranchingMinds.